John, did you push the bell? I didn't hear it. And yes, you may read what I'm saying as I say it, and I hope that that's going to be helpful. I tried it a few months ago when it first came out, and it looked like a lot of gobbledygook. But then I tried it this week, and it seemed to work pretty well. So we will just see how it goes. Michael, why are you smiling? Understood me. It's smarter than a lot of folks. Can you fill in the blank there, Michael? Yeah, there you go, buddy. God willing, next Sunday morning, we're going to conclude our study of James. And 2 weeks from today, begin our study of Ecclesiastes. So let me encourage you to prepare ahead and at least read the book of Ecclesiastes prior to our beginning our study in 2 weeks. This morning we're in James chapter 5. Last week we concluded with verse 9, so it seems reasonable that we begin today with verse 10, and Kurt has everything set up and ready to go. So we will do that at this time. In verse 9, James had reminded his readers that they should be cautious when it comes to groaning. I think the word we would probably use is complaining, and to remember that there will be a judgment, and we should live in anticipation of that judgment. Now, having said that, we turn to verse 10, and here James says, as an example of suffering and patience. Remember, this letter started in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12, with an instruction to the saints as to how they are to deal with adversity. And I have reminded you numerous times that the typical response is either rage or resignation, but the response of a Christian, according to James, is to rejoice. And I will tell you, as you probably already know, that sometimes what God demands of us is not easy to comply with, but it's still what he expects and is therefore our goal. And sometimes, did it translate that, Mike? No, it didn't, Michael. Sometimes it's extremely difficult to do what we are told to do, but we always know that when we do, it is the right course. And it's probably something that all of us have to work to accomplish, to rejoice when life gets hard, and it does, and James is closing this letter by reminding us again that life is not easy. God expects us to face suffering, but to do it with patience. Here he says that what will help us to do that is to look at the example of the prophets. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. I'm hard-pressed to think of a single prophet that didn't have problems in his life. If you can think of one, I would be happy to entertain who he was and how he managed to get through life unscathed, but I haven't been able to do that. And so James, realizing that there's a host of examples of faithful men of God who maintained their faithfulness in the midst of suffering, says, look at the prophets. That reminds me of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, when he lays down those 8 Beatitudes. The final one is, blessed are they that are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and then went on to say that they persecuted the prophets. Why should we expect to go through life unscathed? It's not going to happen. But we do choose how we will respond when those difficulties enter life. So, as we begin this morning, James is focusing on the example of the prophets, and he wants Christians to look at their example and attempt to emulate it in our lives as men and women of God. The prophets were men who spoke the truth in the name of God. They spoke it with the authority of the Lord, and as a result, suffered for their boldness in the proclamation of truth. I want to give you very quickly some examples of prophets, men of God that we could look to, and how they suffered and what they teach us as a result. I think the best place to begin would be with Moses. Moses, and nearly everyone knows his story, was of Hebrew parentage, but because of Pharaoh's decree, male children were not supposed to live. After 3 months, his mother placed him in the ark among the bulrushes there on the river. And I'll pause and remind you that an ark is literally a box. That's why we have the ark here Moses is placed in. It's a box, obviously waterproof, and he's abandoned there with his sister Miriam watching over him from a distance. The Ark of the Covenant that most of you are also familiar with, where the table of stones, the pot of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded were kept, was a box, an elaborate box. And when you think of Noah's Ark, I know every picture I've ever seen is of a boat with a bow and a stern. The best and most accurate picture would be of a box, probably closer to the barges that we see running up and down the Ohio all the time. That's the meaning of the word. And I know that has nothing to do with James, but it just seems to me that we need to be aware of these things. Moses is placed in the ark and abandoned there on the river to be found by Pharaoh's daughter. He is raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter and given every advantage, a wonderful education, but by providence, his own mother was hired by Pharaoh's daughter to be his nurse. And I think there's every reason to believe that that relationship continued throughout his life, and she indoctrinated him with the whole idea of his being a child of Abraham and the allegiance that he should have to the God of gods, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he never forgot that. And because his allegiance was not to Egypt, but to the God of Israel and to his own people, he slew an Egyptian, thought no one knew, but clearly others did, and was forced to flee to Midian. He spent 40 years in Midian and then returned to lead the people of God out of bondage. And if you want an idea of what that job was like, read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They were constantly complaining, murmuring against him and against God. And I find it striking personally that there's a warning here in our text today from James 5 against groaning, murmuring, and complaining. I don't think it's inappropriate to say my head hurts today, I have an upset stomach, I stubbed my toe. But if that's all you can talk about, that's probably not a good thing. And we all know that everything doesn't go our way. It's okay to acknowledge that, but to dwell on it and to constantly share it with everyone you meet, that's probably not a good thing either. We need to move on and see not the negatives, but the positives in life, and they generally far outweigh the negative things. But we don't act like that's the case. Moses faced all kinds of adversity, and James is saying, I believe when he references the prophets, that here's one that we should look at who, according to Hebrews 11, preferred the difficulties of life as an Israelite to the short-lived pleasures of sin. Pleasures that last but a season, according to the text, means that they don't last very long. I'll go from Moses to David as another example. David was the man after God's own heart, clearly a flawed person, but still a man with a heart devoted to God in spite of his transgressions, which I find very comforting personally. He was actually hunted by King Saul as a man would hunt an animal out in the forest. Can you imagine living life like that with essentially a bounty on your head for doing nothing but serving the king and bringing victory after victory to Israel? That's how David lived. And when he had opportunity to slay his adversary, he flat out refused. If you read the narrative carefully, you'll find that, I'll paraphrase it, David said, God put him on the throne, God can take him out. That's not my job. When he hid in the cave with all of his men, Saul came into that same cave to make a pit stop, take a bathroom break, and they suggested to David, his men, that this is the perfect time, but David refused. He did take a portion of the king's garment, cut it off, to later say, this is where I was, this is what I did, you could be dead, but I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Over and over again, he faced difficulty. What an example. Still, he maintained faith in God. On one occasion, he even feigned insanity. Did you know that? In order to avoid the wrath of King Saul. Then there's Elijah. Generally, anyone who thinks of the prophets and suffering think of Elijah in particular because of Ahab and Jezebel and all they did in opposition to this man's work. And they got to him, as persecution sometimes may. He was prepared to give up. He said to God, I'm all that's left. Let me die. And God said, first, there are 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. You're not alone. And then second, you still have work to do. He told him that he needed to appoint a successor, which we know was Elisha. He was to anoint Jehu as king, and he was also to deal with Hazael, the king of Syria. When your work is done, then we can talk again. And after all of that has finished, Elijah is swept up into heaven by a whirlwind. A chariot of fire came and separated Elijah from Elisha, and then in the whirlwind, Elijah went into heaven. And Elisha got his mantle and then carried on his work. There's the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is interesting because of the book that he penned describing his life and his suffering. Jeremiah essentially had a single message for the people of Israel. We are going to be conquered by Babylon. Accept it and go along with it. Now, who would want to hear that kind of message? I certainly wouldn't, and neither did they. But it was still the truth because of their wickedness, and this was especially true of the false prophets. Jeremiah said, God is punishing us, and he's using Babylon to do it, and we just as well accept it. Made him a highly unpopular prophet, and he faced all kinds of difficulty. He was one time thrown in a dry cistern and abandoned to die. Just one example. But he hung in there. Did he grow discouraged? Absolutely. Do you ever grow discouraged? Jeremiah said in chapter 20 that he was in derision daily. I'm done. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to speak anymore. I'm done. My wife's a little under the weather this morning. A little stomach bug, maybe, maybe not. So I'll use this illustration. Ladies, have you ever said to your husband, this is the last time I'm going to say anything? Gentlemen, how many times has that been true? I'm not picking on women because men will do it too. There are just some things that are so important that they need to be addressed repeatedly. And Jeremiah said, I'm not going to make mention of him anymore, but then I couldn't because his word was in my heart as a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing and could not stay, Jeremiah 20, verse 9. Couldn't help himself, he just had to say it because it needed said. I need to hear things once in a while, more than once, for them to really register. In fact, there are times when I hear things that I don't even hear. I hear the noise in the background, but I'm not paying any attention. I cannot watch a television show and really know what's going on and listen to a conversation too. I just can't do it. Maybe you can, but I need to concentrate on one or the other. If you need to talk to me, tell me, and we'll put aside everything else so I can give you my undivided attention. Well, sometimes that doesn't happen, and so I have to hear something 2, 3, 4 times or more. And I will hear it till I eventually hear it because it has to be heard. Jeremiah was in that state. Get discouraged? That's human nature. But don't let it get you down or shut you down. It didn't Jeremiah, it shouldn't us. Ezekiel comes to mind. Ezekiel lost his wife, and God's direction to him was, you can't even grieve. Can you imagine that? But that was God's message to the prophet Ezekiel. And of course, we've been studying on Wednesday nights Daniel forever. We wrap that study up, God willing, this coming Wednesday evening, I believe. Daniel, you know, faced all kinds of difficulty. But he stayed faithful to God. And I'm not aware of him groaning, moaning, or complaining, are you? I don't even see Daniel so much discouraged as I do just exhausted. He was exhausted more than once. He went 3 weeks, as you know, fasting and praying because things were weighing heavily on his heart, not so much about him, but about the people of God. But he stayed faithful. This is what James is saying to readers in this text. Remember the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Enough examples. I have at least 4 more. Let's look at 1 or 2 in the New Testament. John the Baptist, whom I prefer to refer to as John the Immerser or John the Baptizer, because that's exactly what the phrase means. John immersed or baptized people, and so he was called John the Immerser or John the Baptizer. He was jailed for simply making an honest, truthful statement. You're not entitled to be married to her. You've stolen another man's wife. You had no right. For it, he was incarcerated and eventually beheaded, which was a normal means of execution throughout the biblical period, which we've lost sight of as a society, especially here in America. Somebody is electrocuted, given a lethal injection. Most folks don't bat an eye. We hear about somebody being beheaded, and we just are aghast. How could that be? But the outcome, regardless of the method, is the same. People die. And these beheadings that have occurred over the last 3 or 4 decades that have received such notoriety have taken place in regions where, by and large, people are still living in the past. And so they're still doing things the old way. And what is shocking to us as a civilization or society is just the way it's done in the East. John was beheaded. Wasn't anything terribly out of the ordinary in his execution, but he was beheaded because he was a man of God who was faithful. And that's really the message that God conveys throughout Scripture. Suffering is inevitable. How you deal with it is up to you. Be faithful and you will ultimately be rewarded. Surrender and you'll pay a price here and for eternity. Hebrews 11 we always talk about as the great faith chapter. Some refer to it as the Faith Hall of Fame. And rightly so, but then you continue to read after dealing with Abel and Noah and Abraham. There's a whole host of men and women who sacrificed everything for the sake of the gospel. They even talk about being sawn asunder. Some believe a reference to Isaiah, but I don't know for sure that that's the case. But they were men and women who suffered for their faith. Don't expect life to be easy, folks. It won't be. Remember the prophets, and you stand tall as they did, and God will reward you for your faithfulness. He says, "Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast." You think of men like Moses and Daniel and John, and if you know their story well, have admiration for them. And I think to a degree that's what James is saying here. They were steadfast. They did not surrender their faith. They were not persuaded to abandon truth and embrace error. And today we hold them up as wonderful examples to imitate. And that's what James is doing here. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. Do you know this is the only time in the New Testament that Job is specifically singled out? I found that to be rather surprising, because it never occurred to me to ask how many times is Job specifically mentioned in the New Testament. I knew he was mentioned here, but as far as I can see, it's the only time he's mentioned. And yet you can't say suffering and be a Bible student without immediately associating that with Job, can you? So you've heard of the steadfastness of Job. Job chapter 1 is a perfect and upright man who fears God and eschews evil. His children are all killed in a single catastrophic windstorm that brings the house down on top of them. And then all of his wealth is taken from him, stolen. His wife abandons him. She says, "Job, how long do you maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." Chapter 2, verse 9. His health fails. The only thing that essentially didn't fail was his faith. No wonder James would say, "You've heard of the steadfastness of Job." His response in chapter 13, verse 15 was of God, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." I believe that God is in charge. I can't explain what has happened, and by the way, my friends are not very helpful because they all want to blame me, and I know that I'm not responsible. But God has allowed it. I will continue to cling to my faith in spite of everything that I have faced and am facing. He's described as sitting in the dust with his body covered with sores, a broken piece of pottery in hand, scraping the sores. It's a pretty miserable picture. But he never once questioned God in terms of his existence or his sovereignty. He didn't understand why this all came on him, but what he did understand is that his faith had to remain steadfast. And it did. And James says, you remember Job, his steadfastness. Why would he say that? Because he wants his readers, to the extent possible, to demonstrate a similar commitment, just as Job had. And you've seen the purpose of the Lord. Isn't it wonderful to be able to look back and see that Job was a test case? Satan had argued, he is only faithful to you because you blessed him in all these ways. You've given him a wonderful family. You've given him vast wealth. He's in excellent health. He has a loving wife. That loving part I'm not so sure about. But he's got it made, and He's faithful to you because life's just easy for him. It's easy to be a believer when everything goes your way. And God's response was essentially, that's not so. I'll prove it to you. You can destroy his family. You can take his wealth. You can destroy his... You can't kill him, but you can destroy his health. He'll still be faithful. And he was, because his faith wasn't contingent on God's blessings. His faith came about because he understood who God was and who he was, creator and creature, and the creature looks up to the creator. And Job did. And the creature does that regardless of what is happening around him or her. The prophets did. Job certainly did. His faith doesn't waver. I find nothing in the entire book that would indicate that Job ever considered abandoning his faith in God. He had lots of questions and not many answers, but he continued to believe. What kind of bad stuff is in our future? I don't have a clue, but I pray that whatever it is, I can keep my faith. Isn't that what James is saying to his readers here? God hasn't promised you that life will be easy. He's told you, in fact, that it won't, but you be faithful nonetheless. The purpose of the Lord was to demonstrate that a man can essentially lose everything and still keep his faith. That's what Job did. And then he says, you also see how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. How does Job remind us that the Lord is compassionate and merciful? How does the story close? I know you know the answer, but if you told me, I wouldn't hear you. So I will just remind you that in the end, God blessed him even more than at the beginning. Isn't that true of all of us? In the end, is God not going to bless us far more than anything we've had here in this life in a place called heaven? When you know that heaven is the outcome, you can really deal with just about anything. No, let me rephrase it. You can deal with anything because you know that in the end, God is compassionate and merciful, and he has something far better in store for us. And it just may be that one of the reasons God allows life to be as difficult as it often is that it will sharpen our longing for heaven. If you have your heaven on earth, it's very hard to see what's on the other side and really long for it and anticipate it. When life is easy and things are good and there are no problems, we can get so wrapped up in the present that we forget about the eternal. And it's the eternal that matters more than anything else. And that's what James is saying to his readers here. Job's faith was tested and proved genuine. Satan's efforts to destroy him were thwarted. Strength came from his faith, enabling him to face everything the devil threw his way. And I think that's really key here. All the problems were the devil's doing, not God. Not a single bad thing that happened to Job was caused by God. God allowed things to happen to Job that were not good, but if you want to attribute blame, it is not blame on God, but blame on the devil. And I think that's still the case, even in life now. Bad things are not the direct result of God singling us out just because he can. They're a result of the devil trying to do in our lives what he attempted to do in Job's life. By faith, because he knows his fate is assured, he is destined for hell, and he is determined with all his might to take as many with him as he can. He can't succeed unless we surrender. Job wouldn't. Moses, Daniel, John, and those other prophets that we mentioned, and some we could have and didn't, they didn't surrender. Neither should we. So we start in chapter 1 with this reminder that our faith will be tested, and we don't have to fail the test. We can succeed, but we have to have the right attitude. Persevere, be steadfast, and don't groan and murmur, but trust God, and He will see you through. Now we can move to the next section. But above all, my brothers, and keep in mind here that this term brothers is not gender-based. It would be just as accurate to say brothers and sisters. When we use the term brethren, the brethren have assembled on the Lord's Day. That's not a reference simply to the male gender. That's male and female members of the family of God. And here the term brother has to do with the relationship that we sustain to our Lord and to each other in His church. If we were to be terribly accurate, it would be brothers and sisters. There are clearly times when the term is used with a very gender-based connotation, but generally when references like this are made, he's addressing the whole church, not just the men of the church. And so this is a command to all Christians. Do not swear. Now, when we think of swearing today, we generally think of vulgarity, profanity, taking the name of God in vain. And that's a proper definition, I grant you, of the use of the word in modern language. But that's not what James is talking about here. There are other passages that deal with that kind of swearing. Chapter 1, verse 26, chapter 3, 1 through 8, Colossians 4, 6, Ephesians 4, 29, Colossians 3, 8, 9, and 10. But here, the word that would probably better encapsulate the meaning would be oath. Sometimes if you're ever called to testify in a court of law, you're asked to swear, sometimes with your hand on the Bible, that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And sometimes the phrase is, so help me God. And there are people who conscientiously say, I can't do that. And I respect their beliefs, and so does government. Government will allow you, if you can't swear, to affirm. You can affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's called semantics, because it means the same thing. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is not what James is actually addressing. He is not saying as a Christian you can never testify under oath in a court of law. I know the background of the first century church. I know what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and I think I've got a pretty good idea of what's going on here. 2,000 years ago, people made frivolous oaths over all kinds of things where they should just be able to say yes or no, and that is the end of it. And then they got really technical and said if you phrase it in certain ways, it's binding, and if you phrase it in other ways, it's not binding. So you can, if you understand the technicalities, you can swear, but it's not binding, so you don't have to honor your word. And I think this is the background out of which James is addressing this concept. Because taking an oath in Scripture is really very common. Let me give you some examples. Abraham, Genesis 21, 25 through 31, and 24, 2 through 5, and 26, 26 through 31. Rahab, who is in the genealogy of our Lord, Joshua 2, 13 through 20. David, 1 Samuel 20, 12 through 17. 2 Samuel 21, verse 7. Shimei, Shimei, 2 Samuel 19:23. And Paul himself, the apostle, actually took a vow, which is, in technical senses, an oath in Acts 18, verse 18. Did all of those examples, and this is certainly not exhaustive, violate the principle that James is laying down in verse 12? No. Because what he's dealing with here is altogether different. It's kind of like the preacher friend of mine who, he's just a really super guy. And he has all kinds of stories to tell. And they're generally very humorous. And he'll say, and I'm not lying. And his closest friend will say, anytime he tells you he's not lying, you could be sure he is. By that, he's exaggerating. Anybody ever do that when they tell a story, exaggerate a little bit? For effect, to make it more memorable. It doesn't really in any way alter the context of the story and the point that you're making. My experience is lots of people do that. And so I'm not terribly troubled by that. But when you feel compelled to state everything with an oath, something's not right. As Christians particularly, we are to let our yes be yes and our no, no. We're to say what we mean and mean what we say, as James tells us here. But in a court of law, if you feel that you can't swear to tell the truth, then don't. Just affirm. Best of all, stay out of courts if you can. It's not always possible. I was in court just before I moved here. I remember this vividly. One of the members of the congregation that I knew well was hit by a city bus up here near the hospital. I was leaving the hospital, and I saw it all. The bus driver pulled right into him, and guess who they cited? They cited Delmer. You know who that is, don't you, TJ? I called him up after I'd heard that he'd gotten the ticket. I said, Delmer, I saw the whole thing. You did nothing wrong. The guy just pulled right out into you. So I had to go down to court and tell the judge what had actually happened, and they tore up the ticket. Of course, that made Delmer very happy because he kind of watched his pennies, which is a good thing because then Helen could spend them later. But, you know, you've got to be willing to tell the truth. And there are ways to do it if you are of a nature that you think this prohibits any testimony in a court of law under oath. Just affirm. And that should salve your conscience and still in no way violate the principle here. He says, as I already noted, let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. And how are you going to fall under condemnation? By swearing, by giving an oath, but finding a loophole, or flat out lying or misleading. Don't do that. Just be truthful is actually the idea that James is conveying here. Just be honest and truthful. You say, well, sometimes if I'm truthful, somebody's feelings are going to get hurt. Be truthful, but it's okay to be tactful. The way I illustrate this is that many, many, many years ago, my wife received a blouse from her mother as a gift. And I can't describe it for you accurate. It looked like somebody had thrown up on it. I mean, it had all of those pukey colors. Everything that comes out of the stomach when you're under the weather. That's just what I saw. I just did not like it. It wasn't mine. She's free to wear it. But she asked me what I thought. Well, don't ask me what I think unless you want to hear it. I said I wouldn't wear that to a dogfight. I realized later I probably should have said, well, it's not the most becoming, or I don't think it's one of my favorites, but I wouldn't wear that in public. I don't think she disagreed with me. But it was a gift from her mother, and you don't come between mothers and their daughters and live well. So I learned a valuable lesson there. There are just times when you need to find a tactful way, but always be truthful. That's how Christians are supposed to live. And that's what James is saying here in this text. So the problem, so prevalent in the first century, was making frivolous oaths. The taking of an oath was incompatible with the sanctity of God. And therefore, Christians do not make frivolous oaths. They just give honest, forthright answers, truthful, but as I say, I think tactful. And you will stand in good stead with others and with God as well. So, in summary, Christians, because of their commitment to Christ and to truth, will mean what they say and will say what they mean. Yes means yes, no means no, and any kind of speech beyond this where truth is misrepresented, excused by a technicality, or in some other manner seen as permissible is incompatible with New Testament Christianity. That's what I believe chapter 5, verse 12 is saying. And that's where we're closing our study today. I heard that bell, and I don't want to start the next section. The final section is on the prayer of faith, and that's reserved for next Sunday morning, the Lord willing. So I appreciate your being here. I appreciate the way you listen so attentively, and I would like to know whether these captions are helpful or not. I can't see them. They're too fine a print for me to read on the screen in the back. I can see my slides really well, but they're just lines of white from here for me. So hopefully they're helpful. If they're distracting, tell me that as well. Just let me know. We're done with Bible class this morning.